So we're going to have, you have it, so you have to show. This is a young girl that we actually worked with, and she's describing what it was like for her. Her name is Kimberly. I think at the time we did the video, she was in college. Is that right? Yeah, she's gone back to college.
Being able to comprehend what I was reading was such a struggle. Doing homework was taking me so much longer than friends and peers in class, and so that was really hard, of course. It just took a lot longer. I didn't get an understanding for what I was reading. I had to reread it multiple times before I even got a surface understanding of what it was, you know?
So you're going to see Kimberly talk about it, I think, one more time. But what we're going to go to, you should have the PowerPoint back up now. Why I showed you Kimberly is to have somebody real, not just me, say what it's like for them. What she's telling you is that she could read the words just like Natalie, but she had to read it over and over and over, and it still made no sense. So we have to then think of what can we do to help these children, and that's go to this theory of cognition. That's dual coding theory, and I call it the imagery-language connection. And remember that we talked about its verbal and nonverbal systems. So Alan Pavio, a cognitive psychologist, by the way, who's just written another book, researched and developed DCT as a theoretical model for cognition. He's very famous for this. Performance is mediated, is what Pavio says, by the joint activity of verbal and nonverbal systems. Cognition is always an interplay between these verbal and nonverbal systems. He goes on to say that linguistic competence and performance are based on a substrate of imagery. So if you've got the verbal and the nonverbal code, he's saying that this is always a factor. It's always rearing its head. Imagery includes not only static representations, but also dynamic representations of action sequences and relationships between objects and events. For us, these static representations have to do with visualizing letters or facts, things that don't move around. Pavio would not consider letters or facts static in the way he termed it, because they could be rotated. But I'm saying that for what we're talking about today, those are the kinds of images that you can have for letters within a word. Dynamic representations are representations that move. And remember and could shift and turn and add on to one another. That's that kind of concept imagery that I believe I gave you an example of with the red-haired girl riding on the white horse. That was concept imagery, different than me saying to you, fip-fap, what letters do you picture? So he identified these two, and we had identified them also. His was from a theoretical base. Ours was from the experience of working with students. He said something that is really interesting for me to look at years later, and that I don't know how he knew this, since he really did not work with students. He said, not like we have, he said individuals differ. So that means that there are individual differences in the extent, manner, and efficiency of employment of each of the systems, and he says according to their verbal and nonverbal habits and skills. I'm going to tell you that I think that there are individual differences in the ability to create mental representations, and that's causal to difficulty with reading and spelling and language comprehension. You should have the role of mental imagery and cognition on your screen, and I'm just going to go through these quickly because I want you to get that Pavio and Nanci are not the only people that have talked about the role of imagery. References as far back as Aristotle in theorizing how men think. He said that man cannot think without mental imagery. Thus we have explained that memory or remembering is a state induced by mental images. Just try to think about something and not create a mental image of it. Try to think of your house. As soon as I say that, something's going to pop into your head. Try to think of the white horse without thinking of the white horse, without visualizing the white horse. The only thing that you can possibly do other than visualize the white horse is to visualize the letters for white horse, or perhaps you're going to say nothing. If I say mushkade washka to you, do you have concept images? No, because that's not English. And so to say that everything that we do is verbal without imagery is to not understand that language always had what Pavio called a silent partner in the evolution of our mind. And the silent partner for language was what? Imagery. The thing is that sometimes it's hard to know that you're even doing it. You can be doing it so automatically. Aquinas said that man's mind cannot understand thoughts without images of them, and James suggested that static meaning of concrete words, so now we're talking about vocabulary, our sensory images awakened. Piaget wrote that over time, schemata become internalized in the form of image thought. Titchener wrote, my mind in its ordinary operations is a fairly complete picture gallery, not of finished paintings, but of impressionistic notes. And Coslin, who's at Harvard, has written many books, and I could quote lots from him. He's written books that are just on brain and image. He says, for present purposes, all that is important is that imagery relates on topographically organized regions of the cortex, which support depictive representations. Basically what he said is that you can measure how people are thinking about something, you can show them something, and a certain part of the brain lights up, but when you tell them to think about that, the visualized part of the brain lights up even stronger than when they looked at it. Mozart said that a piece would grow in him until the whole, though it be long, stands almost complete and finished in my mind, so that I can survey it like a fine picture or a beautiful statue at a glance. Nor do I hear in my imagination the parts successively, but I hear them, as it were, all at once. And so what he's talking about is going to a whole, or what we call a gestalt. Beethoven said, I'm almost convinced that no earthborn being can ever hope to set down by means of sounds, words, color, or in sculpture the heavenly pictures that rise before his awakened imagination. Isn't that great? And Einstein said, of course, one of my favorites, if I can't picture it, I can't understand it. He made all of his thinking concrete. He did what we call concretized his thinking with images. And here's a couple of my favorites. Gerald Ford said, I watched a lot of baseball on radio. That's true. And Pat Lindamood, we were at lunch one day, and I remember took a light bulb picture of where I was when she said this. We were sitting at a Thai restaurant, and we were talking about something about television and radio, old radio, and she said, I loved to watch Amos and Andy on television when I was a child. And then she started to laugh, and she said, oops, we didn't have television when I was a child. That was radio.